Where the hell are you going? Captain, get back here!
Hello and welcome to Crash Course World History. Today we're going to give a history of America and World War II and give you more insight on what they actually did, which is why we're going to cram years of events into 10 minutes. And...
Ooh, near some Alpha! Near some Alpha!
Yes! Tebow! What do you want?
Didn't Chuck Norris have something to do with...
Shut up, Tebow. We'll get to that later.
So, we'll jump right in. So, in 1939, a lot was going on in Europe. Hitler was conquering Europe like... Wait for it. The Mongols. The US was kind of being the person in the argument who's trying not to get involved but get sucked in anyways. A lot of people in the US tried to stay back and say it's not our war, but some people, they didn't want to wait. This resulted in things like US pilots going to England and joining the RAF, which was the Royal Air Force, and it's basically just England's Air Force. By this point, World War II was getting quite a bit of attention from the US government, and the US Navy and Air Force started to escort English ships across the Atlantic and protect them from the German Navy and U-boats. But more on that later.
Didn't they also...
Anthony, please, we'll get to that later. Meanwhile, a man named Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister for the United Kingdom from 1940 to 1945, kept encouraging Franklin Roosevelt, who was the president at the time, to actually enter the war and help the Allied forces, who were at the time were losing to the Germans. As the U.S. entered World War II in 1941 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. agreed to join forces with Canada, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. There were more allies than that, about 50 in the whole Allied forces, but those are just the main Allied powers. Around the beginning of 1943, Winston Churchill favored a direct attack on Italy, while the President of the United States, at the time Roosevelt, favored an attack on France. Both men had their ideas for attacking, but it doesn't really matter anymore because the war's kind of been over for half a century. And both would have worked, but you know. So many run-on sentences! A quick down south into North Africa where Operation Torch was going on, which was the first U.S.-initiated invasion of the West. Basically, the invasion of North Africa. General Patton played a major part in Operation Torch, but more on him in a bit. Short random fact, President Roosevelt actually claimed to have captured a secret Nazi map with Hitler's plans to conquer South America. Couple quick notes on the Atlantic. There was a huge battle that lasted throughout the World War II called the Battle of the Atlantic, which was basically just a 6-year-long battle between German U-boats and ships against Allied convoys. German forces had the advantage at the start because of U-boats, but later the advantage shifted to the U.S. because they got significant aircraft carriers and, escort aircrafts. I mean, come on. Bombs. Finally, we get to the good part. So, everyone knows the day the Germans surrendered is May 7th, 1945, which was also coincidentally 2 months after Chuck Norris was born. Yeah. Let's go to the open letter. Oh look, that's the Blu-ray disc of Patton. Dear General Patton, I love this movie, even though you were really dead before they kind of made it. Anyways, you were extremely involved in Operation Torch, having pretty much 24,000 men and 100 ships under your control for that whole period. You were also considered to be the only general truly feared by the Nazis. You're also considered to be one of the most rebellious, though. Best wishes, Nick Tebow. Time to turn it over to News Maffa.
Well, the war in the Pacific was one of the deadliest wars the world had ever seen. The Japanese were invading country after country, and on December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor, a day that will forever live in infamy among U.S. history. The Japanese had a huge jump in the Pacific, taking Guam and Wake Island in December 1941, and by 1942 they had taken all of the Philippines, the East Indies, and Hong Kong. The U.S. struck back, however, when in April of 1942, they launched a bombing run against Japan that did not do much damage, but proved that they would not sit by and watch Japan sweep across the Pacific. U.S. 1, Japan 0. The U.S. was finally successful at the Battle of the Coral Sea, which was a key shift in momentum for the war in the Pacific because it put the U.S. on the offensive front.
Ooh, Anthony, wasn't there a battle called...
Jeez, Tebow, I just got started. After light U.S. bombing of the Japanese carriers on June 3rd, 1942, Japan initiated the attack early in the morning on June 4th, bombing the U.S. base on Midway Island. The Battle of Midway was over by the end of the day. In all, the United States lost 1 aircraft carrier, 1 destroyer, nearly 150 planes, and just over 300 men. On August 7th, the Allies launched an offensive on Guadalcanal, using an amphibious landing of more than 16,000 U.S. Marines onto the island. While the Allied campaign in Guadalcanal was going on, the United States and Australia launched a joint offensive on November 16, 1944, into New Guinea, the control of which the Japanese and Allied forces had both been struggling over for many months. One by one, the Allies liberated Japanese-controlled islands until the last obstacle between Allied forces and the Japanese mainland were the Ryukyu Islands, which included Okinawa. However, each battle was more intense and more costly than the previous one, which led to military commanders to begin rethinking their strategy. The Battle of Okinawa was the last large-scale battle in the Pacific and the most intense of the island invasions. Unlike Iwo Jima, Okinawa had a large civilian population, which became one of the great tragedies of the battle. It's almost common knowledge about what happened to Japan after they had lost the battle in the Pacific. 2 bombs causing devastating short-term and long-term effects were dropped on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now that we're done with that, let's go to the thought bubble. Okay, so in 1941, the world was already at war. Hitler's Nazis were moving fast, and at the same time, Japan was swiftly gaining territory all across the Pacific. The United States had given aid to Allied powers in Europe, but didn't quite get involved until after Pearl Harbor. The United States had given aid to Allied powers in Europe, but didn't quite get involved until after Pearl Harbor. Due to Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was thrust into World War II. The U.S. took quick military action that turned out to be successful in the defeat of Japan and helped in the crushing of the Nazis. Yet it wasn't all military actions that contributed to the victory in the Pacific and in Europe. Back on the home front, everyday life was dramatically altered. Since men volunteered to serve in the war, there was a void left to be filled in factories of all kinds. Soon the women went to work at jobs previously dominated by men, including welding, riveting, and being an electrician. Communities conducted scrap metal drives to help the war effort. Food, gas, and clothing were also being rationed and altered. Car factories were soon converted to assembly lines for airplanes, shipyards were expanded, and new factories were constructed. Along with this expansion of women's roles in the workforce was also the unforgettable internment of Japanese Americans. Along with the horrors of dropping the atomic bombs, the U.S. also interned 127,000 people of Japanese ancestry. These people were interned with the belief that they were still loyal to Imperial Japan, when most of them were not. 2/3 of the people interned were of Japanese descent but were born in America. Many of them hadn't even been to Japan. So despite the fact that World War II unified the United States, concentrating all production and hard work in an effort to defeat foreign powers, it also created significant divisions among Japanese Americans and the rest of the country. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So a formal surrender was agreed upon by the Japanese on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri. The U.S. death toll topped 420,000 soldiers, and millions of Japanese civilians were killed. To end on a more positive note, I hope that you have learned something from this crash course. And remember, we better get an A, Miss Soderbergh.